I think we have 7 or so hours to go until we can eat again. And Jonah tells me 30 pages until the end of the service. So we're getting there. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Grace Kaplan. My husband, Jonah, and I just celebrated our 5-year anniversary of moving to Raleigh. Since moving here, we have brought into the world our 2 sweet daughters, Rena, who attends preschool here at Beth Meyer, and Romy. I want to thank my husband, Jonah, for sitting down with me and scouring over my entire family history. Through this process, we've learned so much, and it's been so interesting. Jonah is, of course, the public speaker of our family, definitely not me, and so I'm grateful for his love and encouragement to do something out of my comfort zone. And thank you, Rabbi Eric, for inviting me to the Bima today and giving me a chance to do something that I actually haven't done probably since my bat mitzvah, which is to speak to the congregation. I will say the attendance today, in person and virtually, much bigger than it was that day at Temple Sinai in Fox Point, Wisconsin, a suburb of Milwaukee, and the weather today is a lot nicer too. The rabbis talked to us about a bat mitzvah as becoming of age, but as I think back to that time, looking out at my family and friends as a 12-year-old, there was no way for me to fully grasp the significance of that event or the miracle of one specific attendee, my grandfather, Herbert Fantel. Now to be up here, nearly 20 years later, to talk about him on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, there's a different kind of butterfly flying around my stomach. Yom Kippur ends the Aseret Yemei Shuvah, the 10 days of repentance. But Shuvah also means returning. And so today, I'm blessed to be here, returning to my roots and my heritage. And I know that by doing this, it will enable me to be the best version of myself in the new year. My grandpa's story starts in Vienna, the capital of Austria. Many historians regard the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, as the beginning of World War II. Poland as well was perhaps the epicenter of European Jewry, 3.3 million Jews before the Shoah. Austria, though, and particularly Vienna, was home to a vibrant Jewish community and the first assault on European Jews outside Germany by the Nazis and their collaborators. In fact, Austria not only shares a border with Germany, they all speak the same language. My grandfather, Herbert Fantel, was born on March 18th, 1929. His parents, my great-grandparents, were Franz and Irene. Franz, Irene, and my grandpa Herb lived together with Franz's parents in the 19th district of Vienna. Viennese Jews, in general, were more secular than they were observant. They loved being Austrian. They loved schnitzel and strudels, their music, and their art. Still, the Jewish community was strong, about 200,000 in Austria, almost all in Vienna. Jews actually made up 10% of the Viennese population. In the 1930s, Austria was still reeling from World War I, and Jews emerged as the popular scapegoat. As Hitler rose to power in Germany, he also gained popularity in nearby Austria. Except now, the Austrians didn't just speak German, they were also becoming fluent in hating Jews. On March 12, 1938, 7 months before Kristallnacht, and a year and a half before the Nazis invaded Poland, Hitler and the Nazis basically waltzed into Austria and were welcomed like heroes. My great-grandmother Irene actually took her 8-year-old son, my grandpa Herb, to the promenade in Vienna to watch from afar as hundreds of thousands of people greeted Hitler. My grandpa recalls how they stood from afar because his mother insisted they be there, but she was also fearful and wanted to make sure that they didn't get too close. That night, they decided that they had to leave Austria, but the family didn't know where to go or what to do. The next day, March 13th, Germany formally annexed Austria in what became known as the Anschluss. It was ratified by a public vote later that week. It got 99% of the vote, and Jews were forbidden to cast ballots. In the ensuing weeks and months, Vienna became the very first draft of the Nazis' final solution, the first iteration of a ghetto, the first deportations. Jews were harassed, fired from businesses, synagogues burned, homes were also looted, and the Nazis ordered all Jews to itemize and declare their personal property. The Vienna model, as it became known, gave the SS their trial and errors before the Nazis continued their blitz through Europe. As for the Fandels, they were miraculously spared at first. My great-grandfather, Franz's two brothers, Oscar and Joseph, were high-ranking officers and had fought for the Austrian army in World War I, which provided them with a layer of protection. Also during this time, my grandpa Herb came down with scarlet fever, which ironically turned into a benefit since the quarantine sign on their door kept the Nazis and their collaborators away as they went door to door pulling Jews out of their homes. My grandpa Herb was pulled out of his school and forced to attend a school for only Jewish children. He said the kids yet were not wearing yellow stars, but those around him who were not Jewish stood out with their Nazi pins and buttons. Behind the scenes, Grandpa Herb's parents were still looking into leaving, as were most Jews in Austria. At the time, it was still very easy to get out of the country, but it was hard to find a country to take you in. Shanghai, China actually emerged as one destination, but it was very expensive to get there, and that priced out many families, including my own. Kristallnacht, the notorious riot against synagogues and Jewish businesses, would start on the night of November 9th, 1938. For my grandpa Herb, though, it began ominously that afternoon because his father, my great-grandfather, who was a banker at Länderbank, didn't come home from work that day. My great-grandfather, Franz, was actually arrested and sent to Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp. After my great-grandmother, Irene, learned of her husband's arrest, my grandpa Herb said, quote, "That set my mother in motion. She had one thought in mind, I've got to get him out." The only way to do that, though, was to get visas. That finally happened, but not without one important wild card. Friends helped obtain 90-day visas to Great Britain. That means they could legally only stay there for 3 months, and then technically they'd have to return to Austria. My great-grandmother, though, thought it was worth the gamble. The other caveat was there were only 3 visas, meaning no one else from the Fantel family could go. Grandpa Herb said his mother, Irene, lived with that regret her whole life, having to leave the rest of their family behind. My great-grandfather, Franz, miraculously returned from Dachau on January 13th, 1939. My grandpa Herb said that his father was unrecognizable, bruised, beat up, and he had lost 40 pounds, 1/3 of his body weight. In some ways, he would never recover because he would suffer from seizures throughout the rest of his life. As they prepared to flee, my great-grandma Irene actually packed up as many of their belongings that would fit in a giant wooden storage lift. She put as much as she could in there, including the family's Busendorfer baby grand piano. And spoiler alert, the piano today is at my parents' house in Milwaukee, and I'll talk more about that. On June 10th, 1939, my grandpa Herb and his parents fled Austria with the enormous wooden lift and the equivalent of $15 in cash. As I mentioned before, there were no visas for anyone else in the family. He would learn later that they were deported and murdered either at the Loge Ghetto or Theresienstadt death camp. 2 sponsor families in Scotland arranged the transfer to Musselburgh, a suburb of Edinburgh. My grandpa Herb recalls those families, a Lord and Lady Mears and a Lord and Lady Walton, and said they were incredibly good to them. Now remember that 90-day clock was ticking, so as nice as it was in Scotland, the gamble was my family would have to find something more permanent or be deported back to Austria. Thank God the gamble paid off. Not only did they get visas to go to the US, but the fact that they went to Scotland in the first place was kind of a miracle. Of the 200,000 Jews in Austria before the Shoah, more than 140,000 fled by 1940. But many would go to places like France, Hungary, Belgium, and Czechoslovakia, which would all become Nazi territory. Their fleeing Austria then only delayed their inevitable suffering. In August 1939, 2 months into the 3-month visa in Britain, my Grandpa Herb and great-grandparents boarded a ship for New York. Ironically, it was aboard the Holland America line, the first of probably 30 to 40 cruises my Grandpa Herb would take on a Holland America ship. He and my grandma were big cruisers, and I have no idea at that time whether or not there was a buffet on board. Probably not. The family would settle in a one-room apartment on New York's Lower East Side, but my great-grandparents had a hard time finding work. What supported the family for months was actually a big monetary gift from the Scottish families. To try to fit in more, they also were encouraged to add an E onto the end of their last name. HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, told my great-grandfather about an opportunity in Austin, Minnesota, with Hormel Foods. That's right, my great-grandfather, the banker, could work for the company which introduced Spam to America. Fortunately or unfortunately, the Fantos arrived in Austin, Minnesota, only to find out the job wasn't available, but then pursued another opportunity in St. Paul, Minnesota. They settled there in the Twin Cities on April 1st, 1940, my grandpa being 11 at the time, and they never looked back. As Grandpa Herb grew up, he had a liking for baseball and math. He also enlisted in the Navy Reserves and spent time at an air base in Michigan. In 1955, he met and married my grandmother Betty. Grandpa would go on to get his master's degree, work at General Mills and Univac, and then start his own stock brokerage. My Grandpa Herb and Grandma Betty had 2 sons, my Uncle Phil and my dad Dave. My grandpa died at age 89 on September 2nd, 2018, 7 months after becoming a great-grandfather to my daughter Rena. And I know I teased this before, but I'll fill you in on the Busendorfer baby grand piano. The storage lift made its way from Europe to Minnesota, which is just amazing to me, in 1941. And I only learned this recently, but my great-grandmother was actually a concert pianist playing on that piano, and she found out that her piano teacher was a Nazi and had a hard time playing ever again after that. And I do hope that my great-grandmother would be proud to know that I learned and played for many years on that same piano. As I stand here finishing the story, I come back to that idea of returning. Grandpa Herb actually returned to Austria 5 times between 1971 and 2008. The Austrian government, in fact, fully funded one of those visits in partnership with the Jewish Welcome Service. He attended synagogue there and met the Austrian president. My extended family has also returned to Austria, and a couple years ago placed a memorial plaque outside their apartment in the 19th district of Vienna. The Austrian government has lately done a lot of outreach to the Jewish families who fled, with programs paying for survivors' nursing home bills and long-term care. Austria has now also extended citizenship to survivors' descendants. So I am awaiting an Austrian passport for myself as well as our daughters, and soon we will officially be dual citizens. What amazed me is that after all of the family had to go through, my Grandpa Herb was always proud of being Austrian. He loved his home country. He also loved being Jewish. I'm not sure he meant it to be this way, but he was a model for how we can all live in the diaspora, a balancing act of identities. I think he also wanted us to know how Austria's history should forever be a warning, even to us in America. We are only welcome here until we are not. And if not for the Jewish community and other kind, thoughtful human beings looking out for one another, my grandpa and great-grandparents may not have made their way out to safety. Grandpa Herb was never religious. In fact, he didn't even have a bar mitzvah until he was 83. Rituals aside, though, he found other ways of affirming his Jewish identity. He and my grandma were extremely philanthropic to the St. Paul Jewish Community Center and the Holocaust Jewish Studies and Austrian programs at the University of Minnesota. It's at the University of Minnesota where my grandpa's story is recorded, along with a portrait that was painted of him while he shared his story. I think of my grandpa often, his irreverent humor, his love of cruising, or even just his sitting in a chair with his legs crossed and arms folded, observing the family around him. He was not the most demonstrative man, but he expressed his love in his own ways. I think that was the way the pain from the Shoah and his childhood persisted. In closing, I want to call attention to the prayer that is normally recited at this time in Yom Kippur. It's a poem called Eleh Ezkarah. It means, "This is what I will remember." What's interesting is that it's in the singular, not plural. To me, that means we each must find meaning in our family's history and how we will become part of that history. Grandpa's Hebrew name was Yehezkel or Ezekiel, which means God will strengthen. How fitting then that God strengthened the resolve of my Grandpa Herb and his parents to not just survive the Holocaust, but to seek a new life of freedom and fulfillment. I pray that I will embody that strength and resilience in raising a Jewish family this year and every year. And so, Kreinu L'chaim, may God remember us for life. Amen.
Amen.